state these last 4 weeks. Hopefully next year we'll actually get to see you in person. We do hope you've enjoyed this format of it being live and broadcast from the Roxy here in Lockport, Illinois. We want to thank everybody for their kindness and their consideration, for the collaboration. And I just do want to take a moment to reach out and thank Anna Vivanti and Amy Burke and Bob and Ann for helping us produce this and get this out to all of you, and also to find it posted on the ICPN website. So if you missed it or your friends have missed it, please feel free to go back and catch up and find out what else we've been working on the last 3 weeks. Most of all, I do want to thank all of the ICPN teams across the state. You are an amazing group of people. You are out there in all different conditions. Throughout the COVID pandemic, you never once stopped or missed a beat. You guys care, you work so hard, you go above and beyond. Your discretionary effort and your servant leadership are truly admirable. And we can't thank you enough, because it's all of you who make us who we are as part of the support service team. So thank you all very, very much. I want to introduce Kevin Aldridge, who is going to then part of the Aldridge Palay group. And Kevin's going to share a little bit more with us about a resource that's available to everybody. And we're really grateful to have him and his partner Laura here again this year.
Thanks, Kim. I just had to walk across here and got applause. That's wonderful. I grew up in Illinois. It's wonderful to be back. It was again a joyous experience to fly into O'Hare like it always is. The greatest thing is that a lot of the work we do is like in northern Ohio and towards Pittsburgh. So Laura always gets to talk about how great it is to be close to home in Cleveland. I just want to tell you very quickly, we were working in Cleveland in 2016 in October when in Game 7 the Cubs beat the Cleveland Indians series. The first time the Cubs had been in the series since 1945, the first time they won the World Series since 1911. Some of you probably heard me talk about that a little bit a few months ago when Laura and I had an opportunity to do a couple of webinars for the network. And Laura did one on trauma-responsive care, and I did one on implementing trauma-responsive care. She is, Laura is, as you'll see, very, very shy and quiet, and too shy to mention her book. So I'm up here to mention her book that was just released by NAD Press, The Way Through Trauma-Responsive Care for Intellectual and Developmental Disability Professionals. Again, it's just out. There are a couple of sample copies outside on a table out there, and there's also a QR code there, so if you're interested, you could tag that code. For those of you joining on TV, hi Mom. Anna is putting the link to Amazon in the chat box so that you can go on there and, I don't know, buy Christmas gifts for those of you love. So take a look at it. A follow-up, my book, right now tentatively called Making It Stick, is going to the editor next month and should be out hopefully later this year or early next year. So I'll come back and make you guys show up so I can talk about that. Okay. So, without any further delay, I've been practicing this all morning. Okay, is everybody ready? Looks like we're ready. Ladies and gentlemen, live from the Roxy, it's Laura Palay.
I knew the Cubs were coming into this. I just knew it. So we'll take another shot. Everyone's already said some wonderful thank yous, but I just want to add a couple of my own. We've been lucky enough to work with ICPN and Trinity and some other great folks here in Illinois for a few years now, and it does feel like coming home, Cubs issues aside. So I'm also very grateful to be here today, and I'll share a story. As I was putting this together, I thought a lot about conversations that we'd had with Kim and with Anna and some other folks about what this series has been and how Aldridge Palay could contribute to this. And I know in one conversation, Kim and I were talking about just a wide range of things, whether it was grief or meaning, self-care, all of those things, because we all, I think, are so hungry right now for all of those topics. And I was nervous. I was really nervous putting this together because they're so important. And I could stand up here for hours and talk about any one of those things, whether it's the stresses and the losses that our individuals have gone through, or the grief that we may be experiencing, or burnout, or how do we find meaning, all of those things. And so as I thought about this, I had to go back and reflect on what the past few years have really been like. And I found myself surprised because I found myself getting emotional at times, putting some things together, and I didn't really expect that. And I started thinking about adaptability. If you ask someone what makes a human being maybe different from other primates or other animals or whatever it is, often one of the things we'll talk about is how adaptable we are. If you give human beings a problem or a tough situation and a little bit of time, we will figure it out, and we will be able to handle things that before, if you told us, hey, this is going to happen, or how do you feel about this? We would have said, oh no, I can't possibly do that. And I've seen this over and over and over and over, whether I'm talking with staff at a house who had to be there for days on end after their shifts were over until they could get people in during the lockdown, or leadership talking about how can we get protective materials to our staff when no one has any and we don't know what's happening or what's going to come next. And I realized that adaptability, that gift that we have, sometimes is also a curse. There's so many things that we can so quickly forget about and sort of adopt as normal. And so what I found as I was thinking about this opportunity to be with you guys and how I might use this time, I really thought about what is it that we've all been through? Like, we're still going through it, right? But just looking over the past few years, what has this actually been? So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit about some of the impact that we already know about. There's most of the impact we don't know yet and won't for some time. And then I thought, well, I don't want this to be just another self-care thing, right? I don't know about you guys, but when I see self-care, especially, this is not to exclude the dudes in the room, but for a minute, I'm just talking to the women. I don't know about you guys, but when I see self-care, two things. Number one, kale always appears sooner or later on that list. And I know it's good for you, but at what cost? That's what I ask. But the other thing is, it's always something I'm not doing. It's just something I can put on a long list of stuff I'm not doing, or I'm not doing enough of it, or I'm not doing it the right way or whatever. And so I'm very careful now about even using the word self-care. But I did want to bring some gentleness to our time today, and we will be doing a couple of practices that are purely voluntary that I think can help move us into that place. And then I thought about, what would you guys be struggling with the most? What would you be worried about the most? And I know you. I've only gotten a chance to meet a few of you, and we had some really amazing conversations with people, and some of the things that folks are doing. But even though I haven't talked to the rest of you, I know you. And I know that one of the things that you're thinking about all the time is, how can I possibly help with this? Whether you are a staff person and you're thinking about what it's been like for your individuals over the past 2 years, or you are a parent struggling to get your kids through homeschooling, which now we are apparently all qualified to do, or a partner, or you have aging parents, or you've had people in your family who are sick, or you're a supervisor, or you're a director, your leadership. How can I possibly support my colleagues and my friends, my coworkers, with all of the emotional stuff that we're going to be doing over the months and years to come? And I've realized that as a therapist, I've learned some things about how to be present when there's nothing to be fixed. And we'll talk about that a little bit. I've put together some lessons that I've learned about what does it mean to be with people, and how do we bring that presence both to someone else, an individual, a friend, a coworker, a family member, a spouse, a supervisee, a colleague, whoever that is. But how then do we also bring that presence to ourselves? Because we're going to need a lot of that as well. So I'm not really big on slides, but I'm going to go through some slides. And I thought it would help to start just for a moment, taking just one step back and looking at what really have we lived through. 84 million people got sick. 1 million of them died in this country. $500 million people got sick. And we lost 6 million of them in the world. That's what happened. In 2020, the Federal Helpline for Mental Health and Substance Abuse got 833,598 phone calls. In 2021, 1,200,000 people called. We don't know what the numbers will be yet for 2022, but it'll be higher. So what are we left with? What do we have now? A recent study was done that was published in the Harvard Medical Review just a few weeks ago. Psychological distress, fatigue, brain fog, and other conditions have increased among people who have not been infected. What it's been like to deal with and recover from COVID is a whole different conversation that we could have. But for those of us who never got sick, they've identified 2 factors that indicate brain inflammation for people who did not get COVID. What that means is the stress that we've all been through without having had to deal with the disease itself has potentially, this is early research, created brain inflammation, which is an indicator of stress. And that's when you start having real effects on the brain and body, right? And I wanted to include this. There are a million studies being done right now. There are a bunch of facts I could throw at you about stress and COVID and what this has all been. I chose this one because for so many of us, and again, dudes, you're totally included in this, but women, I think we are sometimes more guilty of this. We tend to treat stress like something that we should be able to roll with, right? It's not that big of a deal. I'm just stressed out. Oh, I just need to manage my stress better. Oh, I probably need more self-care, or God forbid, kale. We think that stress is this imaginary mental state, and we should somehow be able to just sort of brush it off. And for me, this caught my attention because it's not just, turn that frown upside down. You need more me time. We all probably do need more me time, but there really are some effects on our brains and bodies without ever potentially having been infected. So I just feel like sometimes I just want to validate that, you know, for myself and for you guys. It's real. Again, we are going to be inundated with studies over the years, probably decades to come, about what this experience has been like. But just grabbing a couple, putting these slides together for you guys. Studies have already identified anxiety, disrupted grieving, role confusion. Are you a parent? Are you a teacher? Are you a caregiver? Are you an administrator? Are you now a service coordinator trying to get this sick family member something they need? Lowered distress tolerance. That usually means we just freak out or get angry or get upset more easily. Parental distress. Parents not feeling like they're doing a good job as parents anymore. Lowered self-efficacy. I feel powerless. Economic and employment worries. Exhaustion. Depression. And those are just in adults. We don't know yet the long-term impacts on adolescents and children. I think that's going to unfold itself over the years to come. So what can we do? I love this saying. I was a theater nerd when I was a kid. Very surprising to you guys, I'm sure. Any musical theater folks out there? I know I've got a couple. There we go. We'll talk later. All right. So in the theater, you are your instrument just means there's nothing else you need to bring to the stage, right? It's great if you've got props or a gimmick or a gag or this or that or a costume or a mask. But really what you develop, what you pay attention to, what you come back to is you. You are your instrument. Think about that for a second. If we as helpers, if we as caregivers treated ourselves that way. Anybody here play a musical instrument when you were a kid? Okay, I've got a couple of folks. Can I ask what instrument did you play?
Piano.
The piano, okay. Does anyone play an instrument that is smaller than a piano for the purposes of this example? Yes.
Flute.
Perfect. No offense to the piano. Flute, perfect. Okay, I'm like, a piano, okay. So imagine that you went on to become a concert flute player. What are they called? Flautist? A flautist, okay. How would you take care of that flute? You'd probably have like a really fancy one. Did you have a nice flute when you were playing it?
I actually went to school for it. So.
Oh, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. I could just have you come up here and talk about this. Okay, so how do musicians treat their instruments? You get high quality instruments, you take care of them, you carry them in a cute little case, right? Probably you didn't carry your piano around. I don't know, I didn't know your life, but probably not, right? But even if you were a concert pianist, right? Like you'd be careful about how it was treated and how it was put on stage, and you'd keep it in tune, you take care of it because it's your instrument. Well then, if you are your instrument, how do you take care of that? From the most basic things about sleep, nutrition, moving around, going outside occasionally to enjoy this glorious central Ohio or central Illinois rainy weather. Whatever it is, if we treat ourselves as our instrument, number one, I do think it makes us think about how am I caring for this? How am I nurturing this? But I also think it helps in another way. As a psychotherapist, and I've been in private practice for 30 years now, going on 30 years, I know what it's like to feel completely and utterly unequipped for what is in front of me, that I don't have the right tools. Looking into my mental health peeps, yep. Maybe if I'd gotten more training, maybe if I went to another seminar, maybe if I learned another toolkit, maybe there's a workbook, but whatever it is, I don't have it. And I've learned over years of doing a lot of work, from trauma and grief and loss to parents who've lost children to cancer. Sometimes there is no tool. There is no intervention. There is no workbook, you know? There's not even an app, and not even Kale will do it. Sometimes all you have is being in the room. And that's okay, because you are your instrument. The other stuff's great. Interventions, behavior plans, blah, 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 whatever. Great, great, great. But when it comes right down to it, when we're in the presence of pain and grieving, we are sufficient. You just need to bring yourself. So how do we do that? Well, this is what therapists learn. This is just sort of something that I remind myself of. I have it on my wall in my workroom before I go into a session, so I can kind of center myself in this. And this is what I taught my graduate students when I taught in the MSW program at Ohio State. Accept everything. Whether you're talking to an individual or a patient or a friend or a supervisee or a colleague or whatever, accept everything. So what does that mean? Does that mean you're allowed to do whatever you want? No. I worked with teenagers for a very long time, early in my career as a social worker. And we were talking at dinner last night that teenagers are, how shall I say, they are the pineapple on pizza of human beings, right? In fact, let's just do this. Can we all just do this right now? Pineapple on pizza, yes? Raise your hand. We are small but mighty. Never pineapple on pizza, that's disgusting. Raise your hands. Okay, we'll fight it out in the parking lot afterwards. But you'll notice that there's nobody who's like, people know kind of where they are in those two groups, and teenagers will do that to you. Do I have any teenager people in here? Okay, I've got a few. Again, small, hardcore, right? You are a teenager person or you are not, and there is no in between because teenagers are insane. But I really enjoy them. So working with teenagers, I had some rules. One was no tattoos on your face. And eventually that became no more tattoos when you leave here than that you had when you got here. And my other rule with teenagers was you're not allowed to run over and like stomp on my foot. So there are rules, right? Accept everything isn't do what you feel. Accept everything means whatever you feel is okay. Whatever you're telling me is okay. Whether it's how I feel about it, or whether I think this is, the right way to think about it, or if I think maybe there's another way and maybe we'll talk about that, whatever that is, whatever is going on with you, wherever you are, is acceptable in this space. Need nothing. That sounds weird, right? Because again, every little article on the internet, every little training you go to about self-care, whatever, is telling you all the stuff that you need for yourself, and that's true. We'll be talking about that. But in terms of how are we present in the face of enormous grief, an enormous loss, an enormous pain, we don't need anything in that space. That sounds great, but really think about it for a second. If you've ever supervised somebody, or if you're, let's say you work with an individual, or if you have kids or whatever it is, sometimes we do kind of need stuff, right? I need you to get it together. Or I really need you to calm down about this. And when I supervised staff in the mental health centers where I worked, whenever I would hear that sentence, you need to, what I heard was, I need to feel in control. I need to feel okay. I need to feel good about myself, whatever it is. I need to feel like I'm going to get through this shift in one piece, whatever it might be. But it's really that person saying what they need, not what that individual needs at that moment, potentially. Sometimes they're the same, but usually I think it's the staff person or whomever talking. So need nothing means if you and I sit down and you start crying and an hour later you're still crying, that's fine, because I don't need you to stop crying. If you're angry and you and I talk and at the end of that conversation you're as angry as when we started, that's okay, because I don't need you to stop being angry. You see where we're going with this? Whatever it is that's going on with the person who's in our presence, the person to whom we are trying to offer presence, we don't need them to change or be different or fix anything. Accept everything, need nothing, try anything. Now again, let me be very clear, just for the state of Illinois, there are some things that you should not try with people, right? But what this means is, within the scope of your job, or within the scope of your relationship, or your licensure, or the local laws, try it. Even if someone where you work says, oh, when I was here 30 years ago, we tried that and it didn't work that one time, right? Or, this is one of my favorites. Well, if I do this with you, I'll have to do that with everybody. Okay, I mean, maybe, right? But frankly, I would rather try it and see if it works, and then we can figure out everybody else, right? Saying, I can't possibly be flexible with you because I'd have to be flexible with everybody, that's a great way to never do anything, right? So again, with all the caveats in place, please do not sue me. Try anything. I don't know why I called these chapters. Maybe this is going to be a book, I'm not sure. But I just sort of thought about it this way in terms of how can I take 7 little pieces and talk with you guys about presence. So 7 brief chapters. Holy listening in sacred space. Now again, a quick caveat, holy, it does have a capital H there, but it's not any particular religion, right? It's not any particular spiritual tradition. Wherever you come from to this, totally works. Holy to me means something different. Healing spiritual pain requires holy listening, not compulsive fixing. And this is taken from a wonderful book called The American Book of Living and Dying. I used this book in my grief and loss class in graduate school when I taught grad students. What is spiritual pain? What does that mean? I don't know. I think it's different for everyone. But I like it here because I think it's a little bit different than physical pain, of course, and even emotional pain. If we think about things like grief or loss, and I could have spent the whole time just talking about grieving with you, then we think of that as emotional. Spiritual pain often threatens connection. It can threaten meaning. It can threaten a sense of our place in the universe. Whatever spiritual system or religious tradition or no system and no tradition that we use to make sense of the world, when things don't make sense anymore, when we don't feel connected in that larger sense, and when we're not sure what the meaning is for ourselves, then people who work with grief and loss and hospice work and end-of-life things, we tend to characterize those things as spiritual pain. And I think a lot of us have experienced that. When I thought about that conversation with Kim about meaning, I thought, well, if you're a helper, where does your meaning come from? Where does it come from, you guys? If you're a helper. It comes from helping, right? It comes from being able to do something, and usually something pretty concrete, right? I'm going to help you with this thing that you're scared of when you go to your first day of school. I'm going to help you figure out how to talk to the doctor because your meds really aren't where they should be. I'm going to help you talk about how sad you are that your roommate left, or whatever it is. Helpers are used to doing. So what's it been like for us these past 2 years when we haven't always been able to help the way we're used to helping? We'll talk about that a little bit later. For some of us, it actually develops into something called moral injury, when we can't see ourselves as good people. And I think for a lot of us as helpers, and I would put parents in there, or the children of aging parents, who rely on us or whatever it is, when we can't do that, it starts to threaten our sense of who we are and how we experience meaning in the world. So I do think a lot of us over the past 2 years have experienced some levels, some people in small amounts, some people in horrible amounts, spiritual pain. So holy listening, what does that mean? Again, we're not talking about a religious tradition. I'm not talking to chaplains or priests or rabbis or anything like that, although a lot of this stuff I think would be very applicable. Holy listening to me means you're only doing one thing, and you're doing it for a particular purpose. I'll give you an example. This is a beautiful space to be in here at the Roxy. It's a wonderful stage and great lighting. And before we got started today, I was kind of pacing around learning this space. Now I want you to imagine that instead of holding this training in a renovated movie theater, it was in a practicing church or synagogue or mosque. Do you imagine that I'd have been tromping around up here beforehand? And that they'd be holding, trainings and bingo and all this stuff in the sanctuary? Probably not. A lot of you are sort of shaking your head. No. Even if you yourself don't belong to any particular religious tradition, there's sort of that feeling of like, Why? Because if it's the pulpit or the sanctuary or whatever, it's for one thing. It's not multi-purpose. Can't do a bunch of stuff with it. It's set aside. It's set apart. It's special. It's for one thing. And I think that this has become more difficult long before the pandemic hit. We all have the entire known world in our hand at all times, right? At any given moment, I can be looking at anything in the known universe rather than paying attention to you. I also think that for many of us, as I've already talked about a couple of different times, we have so many hats. We have so many different things we're doing. So how often do you find yourself in a conversation, but you're thinking about the next thing you have to do? Or, well, I really need this to have this outcome because then I've got to go do this. And, oh, I need to remember that I've got to go pick this up. And, oh, someone's texting me and someone didn't show up for their shift. Da, 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 da. We're all doing so many things at the same moment. So holy listening could be described as simply as you're only doing one thing. And I want to talk here for a moment. I think this will be relevant to a lot of different kinds of jobs and people, but just for a second, how many folks in here have any kind of mental health background? Just raise your hand. I know I've got a few. Okay, mental health folks. If you've ever been like filling out an intake, or you're somebody who does diagnoses, you're doing an assessment, and you're whatever, especially early on, I don't know about you guys, but when I was first doing that as a social worker, I found that I was barely listening to the person because I was either literally checking off things on a form, some of you are kind of nodding, or as I advanced a little bit in my career and I was responsible for diagnosing people, that's a whole different conversation we could be having. But as I was listening, I found that I was diagnosing, I was assessing, I was like, oh, okay, well, it kind of sounds like this, or maybe we're gonna go here and I'll see what he says about this and maybe that. And I found that I was getting further and further and further away from the person who was sitting across from me. So sometimes forms need to be filled out. Sometimes intakes need to be done. Sometimes you're gonna have to write a diagnosis of somebody or whatever it is. And that has its place. But if I'm going to be trying to practice holy listening with you, I have to put that stuff down. Sometimes literally, put the clipboard down, put the phone down. Sometimes, and this is harder, it's that internal practice of, wait, those questions will get answered. If not now, I can come back, whatever. Holy listening means I'm only listening. Now, for human beings, when we want to do something holy, we usually set aside a literal space. And some of you may now or at other times in your professional lives have the luxury of doing that. So if you were a client and you came to see me for psychotherapy, I have a consulting room and it's got like padded chairs and stuff like that. Comfy chairs, not padded chairs. That's probably the wrong word to use. It's not a padded room. I mean, basically it's not a padded room, but so you could come into this room and you can relax and there's a coffee table and stuff. But that's the only thing I do in that room, right? I don't use it to do my work. I don't supervise my students in there. I don't let my kids come in and do their homework or whatever. It's just for that, because one of the ways that human beings experience that sense of presence and wholeness is by being in a space where that's the only thing you do there, right? Many, if not most of you guys here today, and many folks watching who are joining us from other places, don't have that luxury. You're going into someone's home, you have, a space where lots of people are working there. Those of you who are supervisors or managers, you use your office for a million things, right? So sometimes it's not necessarily the space we use, but it's the focus that we bring. I have done some of my best work sitting in a McDonald's parking lot with some kid in my car talking. It doesn't have to be a fancy office. It doesn't have to be a pulpit. It doesn't have to be those things. We can create that sense of holiness with our focus. Make sense? And most of all, what we have to focus on is not fixing. Remember a few slides ago where I said need nothing. It is hard. It is, I think, a lifetime's practice to not need to fix. How did most of you get here today? How did you come to the work that you do? We talked about that a little bit last night, and people had fascinating stories of how they ended up where they are, and who knows where you'll be going. My guess is if you're a helper, you're going to be a helper for life. It may not always be in this job. It may not always be with your current title. You may go do something else. You may open up that cupcake shop you've always wanted to open, but you're probably going to be trying to help people while you're selling them cupcakes, right? How did we come to this? Probably because we found out we were good at it. Somewhere at some point in your life, you were talking to somebody and they told you that after talking to you, they felt better, right? Or you saw someone struggling and you offered them a different way to do it, or you offered them encouragement, or you offered them something and they were successful. How did that feel? Somebody said, yeah? Amazing. It felt amazing. Yeah. It feels wonderful, right? And that's beautiful. But I think if we're serious about being helpers, we have to acknowledge that, like everything in life, there are two sides to that. That sometimes if I want that amazing feeling, or if I define who I am on my ability to help, and I'm sitting with you, and you're not fixed. You're still feeling your grief. You're still feeling your loss. You're still feeling your anger. You're still struggling with your addiction, or I don't know, whatever it is. How do I feel? I failed. I can't define myself the way I thought I could. Or I'm just not feeling amazing and I really, really, really like that feeling. Well, now I'm going to try harder to fix you so that I can get it. And now I need it. Now I need something, right? So we could say that holy listening, one part of it is about focus. We're not trying to do a million different things. We're just here. But the other part might be releasing our need to fix. What happens if Lisa leaves the conversation kind of the way she did before? We'll talk a little bit later about faith, because that's another one of the chapters. But if I truly say that I don't need her to be different, that I'm just offering my presence, and she will do what she will with it, then I have to release my need to fix. And in order to do that, I have to believe that my presence is enough. So one of the ways to do that is to think about seeing problems differently. When I taught at Ohio State, I had the opportunity to teach one of my favorite courses, which was sort of a combination of Eastern and Western approaches to psychotherapy and clinical social work. It was super cool. That would be a whole different conversation to have with you guys. But we would talk about things like Buddhist perspectives and Taoist perspectives about lots of different things about human life. And one of the things that we talked a lot about was problems. In America, if you have a problem, what do you want to do? Fix it. We need to fix it. And, you know, we've got lots of commercials and things on TV that offer lots of helpful suggestions about what will fix that problem. Is it a can of Coke? Is it a trip to McDonald's? Is it some liposuction? I don't know, but whatever it is, if you've got a problem, we're going to fix it. And I think that there are things to be said for that. If I go to, let's say, what's your name? Karina. Okay, so Karina's a doctor. I've got a broken arm. I kind of want her to fix that, right? Like, that sounds great to me. So there's nothing inherently bad about fixing. But one of the things that it does is it gets us trapped in that loop, right? What if it's not fixable? Or what if it's really not a problem at all? One of the ways that I think we can move out of that compulsive fixing is asking ourselves what a problem really is. Let's take sadness. Especially in America, we are not crazy about sadness, right? We like what we think is the opposite of sadness, which is what? Happiness, right? In fact, we literally wrote it into the blueprint for our country, happiness. We are super jazzed about happiness. So if we have sadness, and sadness is the opposite of happiness, well, that's bad, and we need to get rid of it or fix it, right? From a Taoist perspective, happiness and sadness are just part of the whole, right? Happiness and sadness and anger and fear and all of the feelings and all of the experiences, that's just you. The part of being a whole human being is encompassing all of those things. So why would I want to get rid of your sadness? Why do I need to push my anger away like it doesn't exist? Now again, I'm not talking about behavior, right? Some behavior is appropriate, some behavior is not. But in terms of that experience, if I'm looking at a whole life or a whole human being, sadness is going to be a part of that. I had a guest speaker whose name appears on some of these slides. He's a friend of mine who grew up as a Taoist. And he would come lecture my class, and he would hold up his hand and say, let's say that I have the front of my, what is it? The front of my hand and the back of my hand. And I don't really like the front of my hand, so I'm going to get rid of it. I'm going to slice it off. What do I now have? Other than a big bloody mess. I still have the back of my hand and the front of my hand. I can't get rid of it. If there's a front, there's also a back. They're part of the same thing. You can't separate them. So instead of thinking of happiness and sadness as fighting with each other, or life is easy, cool, life is hard, I have a problem, bad, I'm going to try to get rid of it. What if they all fit together? What if they are all part of a whole? So instead of saying sadness is bad and I need to get rid of it, it's a thing that's happening to me, what if I say that it is a part of me? And I can welcome that and accept that. Accept everything. Emptiness and fullness, right? They're part of the same thing. It could also be a sign that it's time to do something. So if I'm sad, is that sadness that is just a part of being alive? Or is it sadness that suggests that maybe there's something that needs to be done? So we can look at problems as signals, but we can also consider that a problem might just be part of the whole. And this sounds pretty obvious to you, right? We'll talk a little bit later about feelings, but in this group of people, again, I know you guys, I know the work you do, I know the training you've had. If I say to you, all feelings are okay, what will you all do? You'll nod and say, yes, that is correct, very true. All feelings are okay. Okay. Let's say that you are, I don't know, let's say working a shift in a provider, group home, whatever, mental health center, it doesn't matter. And one of the people there is very, very sad, or very, very scared, or very, very angry. How do you feel about that? Now let's say that there's another person there who's very happy. How do you feel about that? We like that better, right? And I think that whether we acknowledge it or not, or whether we're more subtle or more obvious, the person who's really sad or really scared or really angry or whatever it is, we're going to try to massage them out of it, right? Let me just explain this enough to you so that you're not mad or sad or scared or whatever. So what does that suggest? That we're not really okay with those feelings. You know? We know we're supposed to be. If I say to you, are all feelings okay? You'll go, yes, all feelings are okay. But not really. So what happens if we say that being whole means having all of those feelings? Then problems start to have a different definition, don't they? Simply being sad, being scared, being angry, maybe that's not necessarily a problem. Maybe it's an indicator of a problem that we want to talk about. But let me ask you guys another question. If I could somehow deal with your situation so that you're no longer sad or happy or scared about it, great. What happens sooner or later? Is this gentleman, what's your name, sir?
Oscar.
Oscar, okay. Is Oscar like, whew, done with that, no more problems, no more difficult feelings for the rest of my life? Done. What's going to happen with Oscar sooner or later? Yes, the lady next to him. It's going to come, right, exactly. And I do think that, as silly as it sounds, in our culture, there are a lot of wonderful things about American culture, but I do think that in the back of our minds, we have this idea that if we arrange our lives the right way, just the right way, we'll never have another problem, and we'll never have another difficult emotion. If we can just handle it right, problems are done. Whoop, forever. If we acknowledge instead that smooth water and rough water and easy days and hard days and easy emotions and less comfortable emotions are all part of a whole, and you can't separate them. You can't separate out the ones you like and the ones that you don't. You have to embrace all of it. Then we start defining a lot of problems differently. If that sounds very kind of abstract, I want you to think about individuals that you work with now or that you have in the past or other folks that you know, and how many of them had problems that were to be addressed, by them or their therapist or their team or their plan or whatever that had to do with an emotion that was difficult for other people. Right? Suddenly, there are some problems that maybe are really just part of the fullness of human life. So coming back to us, how do we offer presence? Well, if I'm talking to you and I think, oh my God, you have a feeling and that feeling is a problem and it has to be fixed, I either want you to get on it and fix that problem so I don't have to feel uncomfortable, or I want to fix it so that I don't have to feel uncomfortable. But if I acknowledge that problems are a part of life, feelings are a part of life, and it's okay for us to just sit with it a little bit, it makes that compulsive fixing a little easier to back away from. Right? So even if this is something that we just think about for ourselves, this isn't necessarily something you have to convince other people of. But if we ourselves are trying to be present and we're struggling with that desire to fix, it might be helpful to ask ourselves, what kind of problem is this? And is this maybe just the fullness of this person's human experience rather than something I have to take away from them? Sorry, I mean fix. Another example of this, we won't spend a lot of time on it, worry. We tend to think of worry as a bad thing. Stop worrying. You shouldn't be worrying. Oh, I'm a worrier. How do we deal with worry? Worry. I think it's bad. But worry has a purpose. What is the purpose of worrying? Preparation, right? Had I worried a little bit about rain, I would have remembered to bring an umbrella on this trip to Illinois. And a jacket, because apparently it's always cold. So in the right balance, worry is really helpful. When worry is too much, then it really does get in our way, right? So the issue is not worry itself is bad. The issue becomes, is there too little? Is there too much? We all know some people where worry is kind of out of balance and there's a lot of it where it doesn't need to be there. We know some people probably where they could worry a little bit more. My college student who just graduated could worry a little more. Just wear a hat, that's all I'm saying. Anyway, the point is, worry in and of itself is neither good nor bad. It's about balance. So another way to think about the problems that we feel so compelled to fix, am I trying to get rid of worry or am I trying to bring it into balance? Can I appreciate worry for some of what it's there to do rather than trying to take it away from someone? Making a sacred space, I've already talked about this a little bit. Sometimes we have the luxury of doing that, and if that's the case, I would encourage you to do so. One of the really interesting things about the pandemic is that space has taken on a whole different meaning, right? We're used to thinking about, oh, we're gonna do a conference, we're doing this ICPN conference, we need a space for it. Well, now we have Zoom and a laptop, and space becomes this whole different concept. So, for example, when I was doing sessions at my home during the lockdown and I had to do it on Zoom, I had to think about the space that I and my clients were going to be experiencing together. Maybe that was just what they could see behind me. Maybe it was what I brought. Maybe it was making sure I was wearing my favorite comfy shoes when I went to go do the session, whatever it is. So space can be lots of different things. But as I've already talked about, it needs to be separate. I'm not doing anything other than what I'm doing. If there's literally a door to close and walls to be inside of, that's great. Sometimes the space is just the conversation that you and I are having, and I'm not letting anyone intrude into that. So those of you who are supervisors, this is a conversation where I'm not gonna let someone run in and ask me a question. And if they do, I'm not gonna, this is so tempting, you guys. Let me just answer your question real quick so I can deal with it, so I can fix it, and then you and I can get back to it. Right? What happens when we do that? This is lost. Even barring a true emergency. And I will tell you guys, the older I get, the list of true emergencies gets smaller and smaller and smaller. At this point, my questions were, is there bleeding from an artery, right? And sometimes these things go together, is there a news crew on the way? If one of those two things is a yes, then go ahead and interrupt me. But if it's not, what does it feel like as a supervisor, as a helper, if the lady in the purple jacket, what's your name? Mary? Okay. So Mary comes in, and I'm talking with this lady in the red shirt. What's your name, ma'am? Ellie, okay. So I'm talking with Ellie. I'm trying to create this sacred space. Mary comes in. It's a quick question, 5 seconds. I can just answer it, right? What does it feel like for me if I say, Mary, I'm so sorry. Unless this is an emergency, let me get back to you as soon as I'm done with Ellie. That's not in our nature, right? Especially women, right? We don't turn people away. We don't not help when we can help. And there may be times when the conversation with Ellie and I is like, it's fine. I can take a second and answer Mary's question. Or I may need to create some sacred space. And that might mean saying, I'm so sorry, Mary. I will be right with you. I need to finish this first. And then, of course, when I'm talking with Mary, maybe I can offer her my full presence, right? So that sense of separateness. I'm not trying to do everything all at the same time. Intention, that sort of speaks for itself. I'm saying, maybe literally in my words, this is really important to me, so I'm not going to let people interrupt, or maybe I just carry that intention and act it out. And then liminality, don't worry so much about that. This is part of a larger conversation. It's simply, liminal just means doorway, okay? So what this means is there's a time when it begins and there's a time that it ends. And that might be, let's say, if you're, group, if I can use an example. So I was talking with Diane last night about groups, right? And how do we begin a group? Typically, if we gather everybody together, like today, how did it start? I didn't just walk up here and start talking to you guys. There's an introduction, and there's some thank yous, and there's a whatever. And we'll do a little thing when we wrap up. Why do we human beings do that? Because we're signaling that we're coming together to do something important. It's separate, it's different, right? Does this make sense? Another good example might be, anybody ever been to an AA meeting, 12-step meeting, or you've seen them on the TV or movies, whatever you guys know? Okay, so they're usually in some weird place. There's no AA building or anything like that. They're in a church basement, or they're in a rec center, they're wherever. And how do people do this? Well, they come together, usually in a circle. Dan, I'm guessing your groups are in circles, right? Circle is the shape of humans coming together. And it starts with something, a check-in, a ritual, a song, a prayer, whatever it is, it begins. And you do whatever is going to happen inside that circle, and then it ends with something, an intention, a thank you, everybody shares something they appreciated, the serenity prayer if you're in 12 steps, whatever it is, and then you go back out into the world. What happens is you've created a space where you've entered in to do special work. We're not going to be talking about what we watched on TV. It's not going to, nobody's checking their messages or doing whatever. We came to do something outside of our daily lives. And the doorways tell us we've stepped in, we're going to do this special thing, then we're going to step out. Now again, sometimes if you're doing something like a group, you can create very specific, very clear rituals that communicate that. If you're talking with a friend, or you're a supervisor and you're supervising your stressed out staff, that might have to be much more subtle. But maybe it's, I get my tea and you get your coffee and we close the door and we do this thing, and then as we get up and we're leaving, if we're both hugging people, we do a hug. Or if it's a staff meeting, it begins with a check-in and we do this thing and everybody gets a snack and then we do the blah, 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 and then we close it and we leave. Liminality, doorways, stepping in and out, signal deeply to human beings, because we've been doing this for thousands and thousands of years, that you're stepping out of the daily concerns of being a parent and a wife and a this and a that and a staff person, we've got this thing, and what about the budget and blah, 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 whatever. And we're coming into this space. So those of you who are leaving here thinking about how you nurture yourself, how do you create that space for you? I close the bathroom door, I drop in the bath bomb, I pretend I can't hear the chaos outside, and I just do this. And then when it's over, I put on my lotion, and now I'm done. We can have liminality, we can have those doorways, we can have that sacred space in our own lives. Or if you're working with individuals or your staff or whatever, how do you create just a little circle, a little doorway where people can step out of all the chaos and offer that presence to each other. I could go on and on and on about this, but we need to move on. Oh yeah, we definitely need to move on. Okay, so pain, I thought a lot about whether I was going to include this, but I think it's better to name things. So I think everybody's experienced a lot of pain. And how do we deal with that? When we're not intentional in the presence of pain, one of two things happens. Either it just overwhelms us, and that becomes stressful in some ways that we'll talk about in a minute. For some people, it gets to a point where we can't even continue doing the work that we want to do if that pain's been too much for too long. Or, and this is a very human reaction, we back away from it. We minimize it, we dismiss it, we push it away from us because it's painful. And so pain requires some skill, and pain requires some thought. We're going to talk a little bit about how to do that and actually practice some techniques that may be helpful. So this is part of a larger training that I've done in terms of burnout and emotional self-care. I'm going to just talk briefly about this. Some of it may be familiar to some folks, others not. Vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress. Don't worry too much about those terms. They're used differently by different people depending on what academic field you're talking to or whatever. But briefly, vicarious trauma is when we are, let me see if I can, some people flip these, but if I recall correctly, vicarious trauma is when we are exposed to trauma secondhand. So, for example, I know ICPN has focused a lot in recent years about trauma and individuals with dual diagnosis, individuals with developmental disabilities. And why I think that's so important is that I'm a trauma therapist in the other parts of my life. So if someone walks into my office and they say, I'm here for trauma therapy, and I say, great, I kind of walk into my office and I know what's about to happen, and I can sort of mentally prepare for that, right? Okay, well now let's say that I'm an individual and I have undisclosed, unidentified, unrecognized trauma, okay? And I'm working with Lisa. Lisa is my staff person, and she knows none of this because maybe nobody knows this. Maybe I've never disclosed this, or it's never been properly diagnosed, or I'm non-speaking and I wasn't able to tell anybody. Who knows? For whatever reason, she doesn't know. All she knows is that I am freaking out or I'm shut down. We'll talk in a little bit about empathy and what happens when empathetic people are around traumatized people. What's happening is that maybe I'm telling her this story out of nowhere. Oh, that reminds me of the time that blah, blah, blah happened to me. And she's like, what? I was just trying to help you get dressed for work. What? Right? Or again, maybe I'm not putting things into words at all, but I'm living it. Brief side note here. I really would love it when people use the term acting out. Laura's acting out. Fair enough. But if Lisa's with me and I'm dysregulated and freaking out and upset and yelling or this or that, I think it might be helpful if Lisa added the word it. Laura's acting it out. Sometimes when we're around people whose trauma is not verbalized or not identified, for whatever reason, they're not saying, oh, by the way, I have PTSD, but they're showing it, right? So what happens when Lisa is hit with all of this stuff and she's not a trauma therapist, she's not doing trauma therapy, she wasn't ready for it, she can be affected by the emotions of my traumatic experience sometimes decades after it happened. So that's vicarious trauma. She was never there, it never affected her, it was maybe years ago, but it's kind of like radiation. You know, you can be exposed to radiation years and years back and it's still doing its damage. So that's vicarious trauma. Secondary traumatic stress is kind of tricky because most of you guys in the room will probably think you're not exposed to this kind of stress. And we do see it more in people like first responders, law enforcement, emergency medical personnel. That's what happens when there's a traumatic event and you are early on the scene of that event, but you were not there for it. So there's a fire, there's an explosion, whatever. You are dealing with the immediate aftermath of that, but it didn't actually impact you. That's a whole different conversation, and that's actually another kind of thing that I do working with first responders, because that's a very specific form of trauma as well. But it's essentially working the same way. You are seeing and feeling the impact, even though you weren't there at the moment of the fire or the whatever. All of these things can contribute to burnout. Burnout is a giant field of study. There are many factors for burnout that we can't control for. Low funding, low status, high caseloads, all of those things, high levels of need. Well, we're helpers, right? What are we going to do? But there are some things we can control. And again, that's part of a much bigger conversation for managers and leadership. But we know that learning to manage and work with and have some skills for pain reduces the incidence of vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress. It can help prevent and mitigate burnout. And it can also help with moral injury. You remember I mentioned that earlier. Moral injury, like many forms of trauma, is something we learned a lot about from soldiers. When soldiers would come back from war, and I don't know if I've got anybody here who's served or knows people who've served, people who've experienced active combat, we tend to think of trauma in terms of what happened to them. But we also know that there's a form of injury in terms of what people have done. So people who, and again, war is sort of the perfect example of this, people who've acted in ways that are not the way they think of themselves as a good person or a moral person. So for example, a soldier might say, yeah, I did things to other soldiers. I shot at the enemy, I killed the enemy. But a soldier doesn't do that to civilians, or there are rules or whatever. And so if people have had the experience of stepping outside of those rules or whatever it is, then there's damage to how they see themselves as a good moral person. Now that sounds very far away for us, right? Okay, well, if you're a helper and you hold yourself to a certain standard, whatever that is, as a staff person, as a manager, as a clinician, as a therapist, as a leader, whatever it is, how you help your individuals, your staff, your supervisees. And now you can't because you're in lockdown. So I don't know how folks in that group home are doing. Or I'm a therapist and I run a group and I can't be there in that group because we can't meet, because I can't get technology to everybody to join on Zoom. Or I have clients who need to feel my presence because they've been badly traumatized and they need to feel safe in my presence, and a Zoom session just isn't going to do it. Or I supervise staff who are worried about keeping their elderly parents safe, and they're worried about their job and they're worried about inflation, and I can't do anything about that. What does that do to us? How does that affect our sense of self? How does that affect how we derive meaning in life if that's threatened? I think we all experienced a significant level of potential moral injury over the past 2 years as helpers. So all of the statistics that I had earlier about the impact of the stress of the pandemic on us, we could add another little line to that that said if you were a helper, it was worse for that reason. So, and again, when we are struggling, the people that we take care of are struggling as well, right? Children, parents, partners, coworkers, employees, the individuals. Oh, there we go. Okay. Again, this is part of a much longer training, but I'm just going to pull out a couple of things that I think are useful here. So the irony about this is that the thing that causes the problem when we're talking about things like vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, which is a term I hate, it's sort of going out of fashion, all of those things, the thing that actually causes the damage is the thing that brought us to this work in the first place, right? So the lady talked about, I'm sorry, what is your name with the ponytail?
Brianna.
Brianna? Okay, so when Brianna said like, oh, it felt amazing the first time I felt like I'd helped somebody, right? Okay, whatever that moment was, whatever that experience was for all of us that brought us to the path of being a helper, a lot of it probably centered around empathy, right? Someone said to you, wow, when I talk to you, I feel like you really get it, you know? Or you're such a good listener. Or, wow, you are really a people person. You just really connect to people, right? That's probably central to what we do. It's probably a lot of how we get our reward from our work. Unless for you guys, it's the high pay and the glamorous lifestyle and the, you know, thousands of followers on Instagram. It's always good for a laugh. So we're used to thinking of our empathetic nature, our ability to connect to someone emotionally, as a really important part of what we do and something that we probably really value about who we are, right? And empathy is great. But like we were saying before, from that Taoist perspective of everything has two sides and you have to look at the whole thing and not just one part. The thing about empathy that's helpful is, so Lisa can connect to me and I feel seen and I feel heard and I feel safe. I feel like she gets it because she's so empathetic. Yay. Okay. But remember from our earlier conversation, I've also experienced high levels of trauma. So we'll actually zoom ahead a little bit here if I can. We'll come back, don't worry. Okay. Everybody, I think here it has trauma-informed care training. I think I've done trauma-responsive care training with a lot of you guys. This is, Kevin would like me to say this right out of my book, if you're interested. When we feel threatened, whether it's something that's happening right now or something that's happened in the past that we're reliving as a past traumatic event, our body can only react in one of two ways. We either get energized and ready for some kind of defense, or we shut down and make ourselves really small, right? So the terms we use for those are hyperarousal, and you're used to that as fight or flight. There are actually 4 kind of manifestations of that: fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Fawning in this case means like moving closer to the threat to neutralize it. So smiling, nodding, being very appeasing, being very placating, being overly friendly, flattering, sometimes sexual. That looks like something I'm doing because I feel great about you. What it's actually representing is it's a fear reaction. For whatever reason, whether it's instinctive or part of my experience, I'm going to try to neutralize this threat by moving closer to it. So fawning. Men and women are both capable of doing this. We do tend to see it a lot in women because it's already socialized into us, but we can see it in men as well. Freezing, I'm going to talk about this for a second, is like stillness, but at a high level of tension. So if you think about if you've ever been driving at night and a rabbit darts in front of your road and it's kind of frozen in the headlights for a second, you probably weren't looking at it very closely. You were busy swerving out of the way. But if you looked at that rabbit, even though it's very still, it's really keyed up. And as soon as your car swerves out of the way, boom, that rabbit takes off, right? So it's still, but it's still very activated and energized, ready to go. So fight, flight, freeze, fawn, hyperarousal. Arousal just means how activated is our nervous system. And most of us, most of the time, spend our time in the middle zone here, this buff zone. We're calm, we're relaxed, our heartbeat is regular, our breathing is even, our blood pressure is within normal range, whatever. Something happens and we pop up into hyperarousal. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. This happens, by the way, much, much faster than you can think. By the time you recognize that you're in hyperarousal, it's already well underway. That's really good. If you had to think about it, oh, here's a bear. Should I run or fight? I don't know. I haven't been stretching. I don't know. Maybe I'll try to fight the bear. Oh, I'm dead, right? If I had to think about it, dead immediately. So you're running long before you've had time to think about it. So fight, flight, freeze, fawn is where some of us, interestingly, about 2/3 of the population will pop up into in the face of an unknown or a threat. But there's also hypoarousal. Hypoarousal includes things like collapse. So instead of a rabbit in the headlights, think about a possum, right? We have a lot of possums in my neighborhood. I don't know why. They just think it's nice or something. So we'll walk outside and there's a possum and I'll be like, right? And that possum isn't still like a rabbit. That possum is sort of like the power has been cut. It's like bloop, checked out. So that's collapse. There's not muscle tension. The muscles are limp and soft. When people go into a state of collapse, you can sometimes actually watch them sort of curl in on themselves. If you've ever watched someone's face, you kind of, once you've seen it, you know what it looks like, right? It's like just sort of the power's been cut, sort of. So we see collapse, and we also see dissociation. Dissociation sounds really fancy, but it really just means this thing's in my way. Okay. Dissociation is a fancy way of saying that two things that are normally connected and together are now apart. So in really extreme forms of dissociation, the parts of the brain that keep conscious records of when and where we are sort of disconnect from each other. So that's when you hear the unusual examples of things like, I woke up in a different city, I lost big patches of time, I experienced myself as different people. That's a really extreme form of parts of the self are not connected the way they usually are. But there are much more common forms of dissociation that we do every day. How many people have a kind of a longish drive in and out of work? Let's say more than 10 minutes. Okay, and you go the same route? All right. So how many of you have been driving and you're thinking about an argument, this is what I should have said, or I went to this amazing training today, or whatever it is, and you pull into your driveway and you're like, oh, I don't really remember driving the past, right? And unfortunately, your brain's gotten so good at that repeated action of driving that you don't need to really concentrate on it. And in fact, your conscious self-awareness has sort of floated off to something else. That's a really common form of dissociating. In trauma, we'll see a couple of different things. In trauma, sometimes what gets dissociated are word, language, and feeling. The clinical term is alexithymia, if you're interested, but it simply means that the words and the feelings are now separated. So Lisa may have this experience at work. She's talking to me, she's helping me get ready, or we're making spaghetti or whatever it is, and I start telling her this horrifying story. Well, you know what happened to me at my last group home, chop, 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 spaghetti, spaghetti. And Lisa's going, like it's really painful and hard to listen to. But I'm talking and chopping tomatoes like it's nothing. I had this experience as a therapist doing a little bit of pro bono work with refugees, and some of them had been political prisoners. I would never have started a session, probably not for years, to be honest, asking them to talk about their experiences of torture. But a couple of times early on, like maybe our first or second session, I would start with something like, how are you? How's your week been? Whatever. And they would just start telling this story by rote. It was like pressing play. And they would just tell it. And I've been doing this work for a long, long time. I've worked with intense trauma and intense grief. And they would tell me things that made it hard to stay in the room. I had to struggle and hold on to my chair not to start crying. And this one gentleman in particular, I will never forget, his face was as calm, his voice was as calm as if he were reading me a list of groceries that he'd just gotten from the store. So his memory was perfectly intact, right? He could tell me everything that happened, but the feeling was completely disconnected. So that's dissociating. Two things that are normally together are now separated. And this also is a survival protocol. Just like hyperarousal, you're gonna run away from the bear. This one is, oh, I don't need to be here for this. And that's actually a really good reflex sometimes. What will happen is sometimes people can tell you, oh, I'm about to become dissociated, but usually they can't. And again, if I'm prepared for it, then I kind of see what's going on with this other person. But if Lisa's just making spaghetti and suddenly here's this person who's freaking out or checking out, and she's empathetic, what is she doing while I'm going up here or I'm going down there? She's going with me. She's going along for the ride. And again, if I can say, now I'd like to tell you my trauma narrative, she can sort of go, oh, okay. But if you're just making spaghetti, who expects that when you're making spaghetti? So you're not even aware that you're getting pulled along. Now, remember when I said that the gift and the curse of humanity is our adaptability. Whatever our brain does a lot of, it gets really good at. And so what that means is if my brain does a lot of going up or going down, it starts to look like this, right? This is what we all are capable of doing. But if I do it over and over and over again, without any help, my window starts to get smaller and smaller. I spend a lot more time here or there, and sometimes even smaller. And many of you guys, just by virtue of what you do, work with people who have interior lives that look a lot like this. They spend a lot of time here, or they spend a lot of time here. And some folks, we were talking about a gentleman at dinner who would smile when he was triggered, which is not uncommon, possibly a fawning reaction, and then would flip, I won't use the phrase, flip the H out, would flip out, right? And so he would kind of go down and then zoom up. So what that means is this empathetic group of people that I have in front of me, the empathetic folks who are tuning in, many of you are spending a lot of time here with your folks because you are emotionally empathetic. So that is why we start to see the wear and tear on helpers. That is the mechanism, among others, of burnout and compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress, because we're going along for the ride. So it helps, and this is where the research is going, to understand empathy as having multiple empathies. So we should be talking about empathies, not empathy. Let me go backwards a little bit through my handy slides. Yeah, okay, we'll go to this one. So there are actually 3 kinds of empathy. The first one is called cognitive empathy. And what that means is I can look at you, listen to you, talk with you, and I can accurately identify how you feel, but I don't share it. A lot of medical professionals and doctors have cognitive empathy, and that makes sense. If you come in, somebody laughed, that was really funny, because there's another little thing coming with that. So you're a doctor, I come into your emergency department, you have to assess what level of pain I'm in to give me some pain meds. It's probably pretty good that you don't feel that pain right along with me, or you're not going to be a doctor for very long, right? So doctors, medical folks tend to be very good at cognitive empathy. I see how you feel, I don't feel it. Fun fact, the other group of people really good at cognitive empathy, sociopaths. Yeah, they're very good at it. Very, very good, right? I know exactly how you feel, and I can pretend that I feel the same thing. Actually, I feel fine. So that's a fun fact to share, especially if you have any medical professionals in your family. Go home tonight and share this little fact. Cognitive empathy, okay. And then the next one is emotional empathy. And this is the one that we're used to thinking of. So when Lisa and I are making spaghetti, emotional empathy, this is, I can identify your feelings and I'm feeling it with you, right? And again, if I'm spending the day at an amusement park, great, I'm at, what's the big thing in Chicago? Navy Pier, right? We're Navy Pier, yay, okay. Great, Lisa wants to connect to my emotions and go along with me, yay. But, I won't take you through the slides again, but if I'm on that roller coaster of hyper and hypoarousal, she's going right along with me. So here's what's really interesting, and here's where the research is going. This is what I believe we will be talking about in terms of helping the helpers for years to come, and that is cognitive empathy. Compassionate empathy. So we've got cognitive empathy and compassionate empathy. They kind of bookend each other, which I kind of like, because compassionate empathy, again, like cognitive, I can recognize how you're feeling, I can identify it accurately, but I'm not sharing it. What differentiates it is there's a wish for your well-being, right? So there's a warmth and there's a wish for you to be okay. If I can pair that with a meaningful action, I will. That's compassionate empathy. Now here's what's really interesting about the research is they've actually done brain scans. And so they've had people wearing the, the wires and the gizmos and the gadgets, and they help people get into a state of cognitive empathy or emotional empathy. And then they have people move into a compassionate, empathetic stance. And what they see is the brain pattern changes. They're distinct. There's some overlap, but they're different. So if I'm doing this with Mary, let's say, and I've got her hooked up to an fMRI, and I'm having her do emotional empathy, which my guess is you're already pretty good at, Mary, right? And then I have you do some techniques or shift your self-talk or whatever, and move you into compassionate empathy, I will see different regions of your brain lit up. So your brain experiences it as something different. And what research is showing us is that when people are taught to practice compassionate empathy, it provides sort of that hazmat suit. So that now Lisa can be making the spaghetti with me and I'm talking about whatever, or I'm acting it out, or I'm in my hypo-arousal state, and Mary can be with me and she can be present with me. We'll talk more about this in a minute, but she's not going along with me. How I think about this for compassionate empathy, I think this is what comes next. Yeah, we'll go through these. Yeah, here we go. This is the one I wanted. Is maintaining a sense of our own okayness. I've tried to think of a good, fancy, like academic sounding term for that, but okayness is the best I can come up with. So what that might mean is, for example, when I was listening to that gentleman talk about his experiences, hearing and picturing what he was describing, but maintaining a visceral in my body awareness that I'm in my office and I'm in Ohio and I'm in the chair and I am okay. I think for me, this really was driven home when I worked with a lot of families with pediatric cancer, which is incredible. And it was my privilege to work with those families for about 20 years. And when I became a parent, I really had to learn how to do this, that I could listen to a parent talk about the day their child was diagnosed, or what those treatments had been like, or in some cases losing a child. And I had to be able to stay in the room, but also remember that my children, at least for today, were okay. I had to stay grounded in my own okayness. And we hear the term grounded a lot. My favorite definition of this, recently I heard van der Kolk talk about this. Bessel van der Kolk is a worldwide expert in trauma. If you're interested in trauma, you've probably seen his name or read one of his books. I used one of his books when I taught trauma in the graduate program. And someone asked him to define grounded, because we hear it a lot. And he said, grounded is when you know that your feet are on the floor and your butt is in the chair. And I really like that, right? That sense of I am here, I am me, I am separate, I am in my own okayness. So how do we do that? How do we create that as a skill? Well, I think we develop two really crucial abilities. One is self-awareness. Van der Kolk also likes to say, you can't do what you want to do until you know what you're feeling. Right? You can't do anything with intention if you don't know what's going on inside. So self-awareness simply means what's happening. And I always teach my students to do that from the bottom up. So starting with your feet, everybody do this with me for a second. If you can, those of you watching at home, I encourage you to do this as well, if it's comfortable. Just get your feet flat on the floor. If you are a petite American like me, they may not always touch, your feet might be swinging, so do what's comfortable, but maybe even like give your feet a little scrunch inside your shoes. Just let yourself feel your feet, right? And then maybe do whatever is comfortable, don't do anything that's uncomfortable, but maybe just let yourself feel the back of your chair or feel yourself weighted in your seat. Feel your feet on the floor and the butt in the chair. When we talk about self-awareness, again, there are lots of academic definitions of this and interoception and proprioception, don't worry about that. But maybe just start with sensation. What signals or messages do you have inside your body right now? Before I started this speech today, I was really nervous, and I could feel that my stomach was kind of, and my muscles were tight, and I wanted to walk a lot, and my heart rate was up a little bit, and those are the sensations in my body. Okay, so just knowing what's going on inside my body. And then the next level up is feelings. What feeling am I having? I'm nervous, I'm scared, I'm excited, I'm sad, I'm anxious, I'm whatever. Okay, so sensations in the body, and then feelings. We're going to talk more about feelings in a little bit. And then finally, thoughts. What thoughts do I have? When I work with people who've experienced trauma, I have to pay close attention to what's going on in my body, because as we talked about, if I'm really connecting with them and connecting with what they're telling me, I can start moving into that hyperarousal state, and my heart will start beating a little faster, and I can feel my face flush because I'm a very pale persuasion, so my cheeks get really red. Sometimes I notice I fidget more when I'm starting to move up in my arousal level. Or if I'm feeling like I'm moving into that hypoarousal, collapse, dissociate, shut down. For myself, I notice heaviness. Sometimes I feel cold. I've learned for myself that I yawn. This might be because the person across from me is also in a state of hyperarousal and I'm mirroring it. Or it might be that something they've said has triggered me in my own history, because we're human, we have our own histories. So for me, the sensation is kind of ugh. And the feelings might be sad or overwhelmed. And sometimes my thoughts will be self-critical. This is too much. I can't do this. I should have done something else. They should have gone to somebody better. I should have studied more. Maybe if I went to another training. Maybe if I read some more books. What if I can't help them? They'll find out that I'm not good at this. I won't be able to be there for that, right? So I'm paying attention to my sensations, my feelings, and my thoughts. That's self-awareness. That's one part of it, right? Recognize and identifying what we're experiencing and where we are in our own arousal range. And the second thing is doing something about it, right? Having some little skills or techniques that we use to bring ourselves back into range, to ground ourselves into our own okayness, or to shift from emotional empathy into compassionate empathy, right? This is a very fancy graphic that I put together all by myself, so I hope you all really enjoy it. As I said, I'm bad at slides. I think this is the second one I ever did with colors, so you're welcome. And this really just recaps what we've talked about. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it. But I wanted to point out one thing, which is that, oops. If you are really connecting with someone and listening to them and talking to them, you may move in and out of this, right? This isn't a mountaintop and you're like, oh, I will never leave. Even in the course of a session, and I've been doing this for a long time, I may find that, I'm starting to creep up a little bit. Oh, I want to kind of ground myself back down. This is fluid, and that's okay. And if you're a supervisor, or even if you're just talking with a friend and you're trying to be supportive or whatever that might be, you may notice yourself moving up and down on the scale. That's completely okay. The big picture here is to notice what's happening and then have some things you can do to move yourself into where you want to be. That's why I like to describe compassionate empathy as a stance. That literally just means I can stand in it. I can move into it if I've been kind of pulled out of it, right? And as we get a little further in, I'm going to actually have you guys do a brief exercise that's been demonstrated to help people move into that compassionate stance. Okay. I like this quote to sort of wrap up this section because I think this is really nice. As helpers, we often have very, very high standards for how we are available to people, for how we help people, for how we do our jobs, for the outcomes we want, and even how we're supposed to be inside ourselves. I shouldn't let this get to me. I've been doing this a long time. Why did I let this throw me? Why am I reacting this way? Blah, 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 on and on and on. And I think that if we're really talking seriously about self-care, or maybe a better word would be self-compassion, just like we're trying to offer in that presence to someone else, then we start with deeply granting permission to whatever it is we are experiencing. I've been a therapist for a long time. I'm pretty skilled at it. And there are still some sessions that knock me off balance. There are still some clients whose history triggers something in my own, or there's something about them that I feel desperate to want to help them, and then I start moving into all of those compulsive fixings and shoulds and whatever, right? I will probably do that all my life. But if I can start from a place of knowing and respecting my own inner nature, some things are challenging, some things less so. Today, for whatever reason, I was able to stay really grounded, and tomorrow maybe it'll be harder. And again, the pandemic puts all of us floating around in that water sometimes. We are all going through our own potentially traumatizing or at least grief-stricken time. Then I can know and respect that in myself, that I'm dealing with these same things. Then I know where I belong. Then I can ground myself and center myself in what it is I want to be doing. This is my favorite chapter. Quiet. It's powerful, isn't it? I've had to learn to make friends with quiet. When I first started as a clinician, especially being a theater kid, looking at you, theater kid, I always wanted to be doing something, right? I wanted to have some beautiful or profound or clever thing to say, or cool intervention, or I'm going to reframe this for you, or blah, 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 blah. I always wanted to be talking, right? And I had to learn how powerful it is to let people just be quiet, whether it's something I've said that I want them to hear, or more often, especially as I get older, something they've said that I want them to hear. My friend Diane and the friend's like, yeah, right? And quiet is scary. Many of you, as I did this in here, I think appreciated a moment of, we get so little of it. So often our first feeling is, oh, it's kind of nice. Yeah, nice. It's good. She's gonna start talking any second now. Oh, she's still not talking. All right, okay. I see what she's doing. All right, that's cool, that's great. I can do this. It's fine. What? No, I'm just appreciating the quiet. It's great. Quiet. We start feeling that anxiety build, right? So quiet actually is its own discipline. Quiet is something that I think you kind of gradually move into and make friends with. But I find that it is one of the most powerful ways that I can move myself out of that compulsive fixing, right? Is to just let it be quiet for a second. I think it allows people a little bit of a rest to absorb when I'm talking to them. I think it helps to demonstrate my commitment to presence. I'm not just gonna be doing something, but mostly it's for me. Like many things, as I get older, I learn that a lot of what I do is really for me. It helps me reset. It helps me take a breath. It helps me check in, as we've been talking about up to now. It helps me do lots of different things, but mostly it helps me step out of that fixing role. And it allows me to remember that really what I'm doing is I'm just sitting here. In this moment on stage when I got to be quiet and just sort of touch in a little bit with you guys, it may have been lots of different things for you, but for me it was lovely because I got to just touch in and experience this group just for a moment. So quiet is your friend. Feelings. We talked about this. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I will say that, again, I think, especially in the helping professions, we're all kind of up to speed on the whole, like, all feelings are okay. But as we've said, we don't always really believe that or really feel that. And I think that too is a lifelong practice of, are all of my feelings really okay with me? Are all of your feelings really okay with me? And I think it helps to think about what feelings are. So when I taught graduate school, I created this list, and it's also in my book when I talk about feelings a little bit. And I call them the commandments of feelings. The first commandment of feelings is that feelings are in the body. This is part of a much larger trauma training that we won't get into today, but suffice it to say, there is a nerve network, mostly the vagal nerve, which is the 10th nerve in your brain, running right down the center of your body like a superhighway. And it connects to your heart, and it connects to your diaphragm, and it connects to your lungs, and it goes down to your bladder and bowels. It goes through the whole thing. It connects to your voice box. Fun fact, how many of you, when you walk onto a shift, or you go home to your partner, or your kids, or whatever, and you say, oh, how was your day? And they go, fine. And you go, what's wrong? Right? You can hear it. One syllable, and you're like, what? One of the reasons is that the vagal nerve connects to the voice box, and it shifts people's vocal tone. And we can be very, very sophisticated in hearing a really small shift in the voice. Some of the individuals you work with, for example, especially if they have any history of traumatic stress, they may struggle with language, whether understanding or using it. They may understand little language. They are probably experts in knowing how you're feeling, partly because of how your voice sounds to them. They can hear it, the tiniest shift, and that's due to the vagal nerve. Anyway, I could talk about the vagal nerve all day. Suffice it to say, that really is kind of the super highway from the body to the brain for emotional states. When our heart speeds up, when our breathing gets more shallow, when our muscles are soft and we're relaxing, about 80% of the information that goes along that network goes from the body to the brain. 80%. So imagine a highway where 80% of the traffic is going in one direction. And 20%, like a little bike path, is going down from the brain to the body. The reason I'm saying this is that I know there are a lot of you guys in here that experience anxiety, right? And if you have minimal amounts of anxiety, you can probably kind of talk yourself through it, right? This is gonna be fine, it's not a big deal, you can do this. Your slides look great, Lara. Remember that one with the triangle? It's awesome, you're gonna love it, this is gonna be great. You can kind of talk yourself through it. But if you have moderate anxiety or severe anxiety, or if you have things like panic attacks, you can't think your way through that, right? And a lot of times we blame ourselves. As I was saying earlier, why I wanted to put some language to our experience of the past 2 years is that when we think about things like stress or grief, we think, oh, I should just be able to kind of think my way through it. But if you've got 80% of the information freaking out, your heart is pounding, your breathing is shallow, your palms are sweaty, and 20% is that little bike messenger going, hey, it's gonna be fine. You can't override that with your brain. Or I should say it takes a long, 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 long time. That's why, for example, if you work with people who get dysregulated and anxious, using breath techniques or movement techniques are much more effective, much of the time, than reframing or talking them through it. If you talk with them and they start calming down, probably it has a lot more to do with their relationship to you and the look on your face and the tone of your voice than what you're actually saying. Thinking is much, much slower. So those powerful emotional experiences come up from our body to our brain. Feelings are in the body. Now, this has lots of implications for trauma, but for you guys, it simply means this. When you're working on that self-awareness and self-regulation, you have to be able to feel your body. That might mean that you take care of your body. That might mean that if you've had experiences or issues that make you sort of disconnected from that, because we all are humans and we all have our own history, you may not be able to feel your body very much. And that might be worth getting help with. that might be worth getting some support with. Regular mindfulness practice, regular exercise. Those are some things, you know, not going all the way into psychotherapy, but something that you can be doing to support that brain-body connection and that brain-body awareness. If you're not aware of your body, you don't know how you feel, right? And remember that order that I gave you for self-awareness. Sensations, body. Feelings are in the body. And then thoughts. Thoughts are always last. So the first commandment of feelings are in your body. Many of you, if you work with individuals, you may have folks who don't have a lot of language, or they may be non-speaking, but you know exactly how they're feeling because you can see their bodies. Yes, exactly. Feelings are in the body. Second one, feelings are value neutral. And again, this pairs nicely with some of the Taoist stuff we were talking about before. Worry is neither good nor bad. Sometimes there's too much or too little of it. It can be out of balance, but it is neither good nor bad. Today's very rainy here in Illinois. Is rain good or bad? Bad. That was hilarious. This lady in the audience, she's like, she's not having any of this Taoist BS. No. It's just bad. That was hilarious. Did anybody here come from a farming community? Let me ask this. Okay. Farmers, the weather's never right for farmers, right? It's always bad. It's never what you want. Okay. So rain. Is rain good or bad for a farmer? It depends, right? Too little, and it's a problem. Too much, and it's a problem. Rain in and of itself has no good or bad value. Rain is just rain. I promise you, anger is the same. Shame. Oh, that's the real taboo, right? We all know we're supposed to be okay with anger. Shame. Oh, shame has its uses. Shame has a purpose. Shame is neither good nor bad. It can be out of balance. It can be misapplied. Shame is neutral. Happiness, neutral. Sadness, neutral. Fear, neutral. Value neutral. How they get used, how they are acted out in the world, that can have value sometimes, good or bad. The last one, the third commandment of feelings is that feelings are temporary. This is the one that I think people struggle with the most, to be honest with you. And that makes sense. My husband works with young children in early education, and he often talks about how when you're little, 2, 3, 4, your feelings are so big that they feel bigger than your body. And one of the things he used to do, and I've stolen this a lot for my work dealing with grown-up people, is when he worked in a preschool and a child was having a really, really intense, big feeling, they would sometimes walk that kid to be in front of a mirror. And the teachers would stand there with the child, and they might talk them through a little bit about, wow, I can see you're really sad because there are tears, and your mouth is like this. But mostly they're letting the child see themselves in that mirror. And the reason they do that is that when you're very little, you worry that your feelings are bigger than you and maybe you're going to blow apart. You can't imagine that your little body is enough to contain this big, big feeling. I secretly think adults worry about that too. We certainly think that we are our feelings, right? We are the anger, we are the sadness. We also think that feelings are reflections of reality, right? One of the things that clients will often accuse me of doing is giving them little sayings that get stuck in their head. And one of them is our feelings aren't facts. Feelings are valid. Feelings are real. They're not facts. Right? How I feel about an interaction that you and I just had, I may have completely misunderstood you. I may be bringing a bunch of things to that conversation that had nothing to do with what you were really trying to say to me or how you felt or blah, 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 blah. So my feelings are valid, but they're not necessarily ultimate reality, right? And all feelings will pass. Many of the folks you work with, we don't need to spend time talking them out of their feelings or redirecting them from their feelings, but we do need to be with them with their feelings and help reassure them and help point out to them and help them watch the fact that that feeling will change. That feeling is temporary. It's sort of a classic example, but thinking of rain or weather versus the sky. Rain is in the sky. Rain is not the sky. That rain will sweep away, and something else will come in. And the rain will come back again someday, just like we were talking about Oscar and whatever feeling he was gonna, and he's gonna have that feeling again someday, right? Things are gonna sweep in and out. The sky is bigger than the weather. Or a train. So feelings are temporary, may seem like a sort of an afterthought compared to this other stuff, but for many of the folks we work with and for many of us, feelings of inadequacy, feelings of grief, feelings of uncertainty, feelings of whatever, those feelings are valid and real and neutral and temporary. They will change. I've just included some things that I think are helpful. I love the work of Tara Brach. If any of you are familiar with her, she approaches trauma from a deeply compassionate stance. She's very famous. I think Radical Compassion is her most recent book. And she uses this sort of step program to help people with intense emotions with trauma, recognizing what's going on, allowing the experience to be just as it is, investigating it with some interest and some care, and then nourishing with self-compassion, which I think is lovely. Here's another exercise that we will go through quickly and come back. Accidents. I think I'm going to come back to that. But I love this quote from Carl Jung. The right way to wholeness is made up of fateful detours and wrong turnings. All of you came to your jobs in different ways, many of which were unexpected. And then we all had to grapple with the past couple of years, which was profoundly unexpected. And we will be dealing with many harsh and painful things. But I can't say that everything that will come out of this experience was all bad. I think there's some things that were revealed to us about who we are and what we're capable of that we never would have seen or known if we had not had to go through the trial of the past few years. So would I wish that this had happened? I don't think so. I don't have enough information about that to be able to make that decision. But I can say that some of the things that seemed like detours or wrong turnings maybe brought us exactly where we needed to be. So I've learned to appreciate accidents. And finally, faith. Being a helper requires a lot of faith, especially when we back away from compulsive fixing. When I position myself in compassionate empathy, and if there's something to be done for you, I will do it. In fact, interestingly, research tells us that when helpers are in a state of compassionate empathy, they actually select their helping interventions more effectively than when they're not. So if there's something to be done, we will be more effective when we're in that state of compassionate empathy. But many times when we're talking about grief or loss or any of the experiences that we've had over the past few years, there will be nothing to be done except to offer our presence, to offer that holy listening without compulsive fixing, largely because in some situations there will be no fixing. And I love this quote from Anne Lamott about the faith that helpers have to have. I've always imagined when I was a kid that adults had some kind of inner toolbox full of shiny tools. I think you could say that helpers think this too. If I get one more degree, a few more initials behind my name, then I'll have the box of shiny tools. The saw of discernment, the hammer of wisdom, the sandpaper of patience. But when I grew up, I found that life handed you these rusty, bent, old tools. Friendship, prayer, conscience, honesty. And I think that holy listening really involves all of those things. And said, do the best you can with these. They will have to do. And mostly, against all odds, they do. I don't know how it is. I've been doing this for a long time. I don't know why that when we offer our full presence to ourselves or to someone else with something that is unthinkable, unimaginable, unfixable, somehow that presence is enough. Not because we've waved a magic wand and everything is different, but because that person we're with, or sometimes even ourselves, isn't alone. And there's hope and there's faith in that. And I know we have other things we need to do and questions we'll answer and discussions that we'll have, but I guess I would just leave you with this, which is it requires such practice and such patience and such faith. And I am hardened every time I get to be around fellow helpers. So thank you, because you help me with that faith. And I hope this has been helpful for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do you have a few minutes?
I do, yes. Let's sit down and chit chat.
Okay. So the feedback online was just overwhelmingly positive, and I think that one of the last comments I read before I came up here that sort of sums up, I think, a lot of what we feel and brings full circle maybe all of our sessions, is that people have this sort of perception that feelings become fact.
Oh, yeah.
And therefore, it upsets me, so it's wrong. You know?
Yeah.
And we sort of have talked about that with the conference sessions and challenging behavior and sort of normalizing, you know, communication with the population that we serve. And so that's, I guess, more of just a comment, but I have so many notes and questions, but one of the things that I really wanted to get to was I was able to look through your book a little bit, and I feel like we would be remiss to not sort of mention maybe, you know, our whole audience. I'm not sure how many people are actually on, 500 and something, could benefit from this. And I think a lot of times we get these books where it's over people's heads, and it's hard to sort of take it and relate it to the population that we serve. So this seems to have been written with sort of that in mind, right? It seems easy to apply. So can you talk about that a little bit? How, if people wanted this, maybe they could take it as sort of a middle management, a case manager, and sort of just use it and apply it without a whole lot of background and experience?
Oh, yeah, I would love to talk about that. Thank you. And my business partner would love for me to talk about that. But I will say this, I think, Amy, you got it exactly right. When I sat down to write this book, talk about faith, there's so many wonderful books out there. And I certainly don't claim that I have some big new discovery about, here's the magic wand that will make Teddy stop doing that annoying thing, right?
Which is all what we're looking
Exactly.
for. We have a small group of ICPN clinicians in our audience, and that's sort of one of our go-to phrases, right? Well, what are we going to do in this situation because we're out of our magic wand isn't working today. Exactly.
So I wrote that book from, I started in mental health as an hourly worker. So I absolutely know that experience of it's a long shift, there's a bunch of crazy stuff going on, you need to get everybody to bed or whatever it is. And I know how joyful that can be, and I know how hard that can be and how overwhelming that can be. And then I became a supervisor and then a therapist and a clinician. And so I thought about who are the people that create the most change in people's lives? And I'm really sorry, you guys, but it's not the managers, it's not the clinicians, it's not even the therapists. It's the people that our folks spend most of their time with. And so I thought, first of all, I want people to feel better at their jobs. I want people to feel successful at their jobs. And I know why people stay in those incredibly difficult jobs. And it's because as the woman said earlier, it's so amazing when you feel like you can really be of help and be of service to someone. So I took what I knew about trauma and I wanted to make it very usable for anybody. Someone who's had a clinician with lots of years of trauma. I think there's some new stuff in there, or maybe just something applied in a different way that may be of interest. For managers and supervisors, I think there's some helpful ideas, but mostly I wanted it to be for those people working with the individuals day in, day out, hour after hour. not just because I want them to feel successful and I want good outcomes and I don't want the things that come out of frustration or misunderstanding, and we know those can be really bad. But mostly I did it because as a trauma therapist, I know that it's the relationship with a trusting human being, and probably it's gonna be you, my staff person, less than the administrator I see once a week or whatever. That's what gives my brain enough experiences of love and safety that allow me to heal. And so I want everybody who needs it to have trauma therapy and meds and, you know, augmented stuff and blah, blah. But mostly I want this.
Right.
And that's why I aimed it for the people who are the most powerful and have the best opportunity to create that healing for other people.
Well, and I think you did a great job of it. I haven't had a
Thank you.
chance to read it from cover to cover, but I, you know, did look at it during the presentation, and it seems so relatable, which is challenging for us to sort of hit those, we call them direct support professionals, you know, DSPs, whatever, caretakers, whatever sort of word we're using, is to find something that they can relate to and then take it and apply it. You know, and
Yeah.
I think it's written in such a way that it is easy for them to, you know, there's not huge words in there. We talk about trauma-informed care, and it's like, you know, sometimes your eyes start rolling, right? It can be a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, there's some workbooks, there's some simple questions that sort of provoke, and so I do recommend this. I'm not trying to plug the book by any means, but I think that it is sort of a nice segue, and we won't have time to answer all the questions, but I think a lot of them could be answered with, you know, sort of a continuation of looking through the book.
Oh, great.
Did you have any questions, Anna, before I monopolize the whole?
I have a question. So I did read your book, and it was wonderful. I classify it as a can't put me down book. I think I read it in a day. And I will be reading it again. And I took it immediately into practice because it was so applicable. And I have it with one individual in their staff. They're doing it well, but I have some other individuals where staff are really kind of struggling, not showing like a punitive consequence to teach somebody a behavior. And so sometimes I find that's a big struggle, especially when a lot of the frontline staff might not be reading this book. So it's really up to me to deliver this message at times.
Yeah.
And so is there any other like things, nuggets that come to mind to kind of try to get them out of that, fix them?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so the very first thing I will say, of course, is that you guys are the experts in your staff. You're the expert in your staff, just like your staff are the expert in the individual. When I get to do, like, sometimes I get to do case consults when we travel around the country and talk to people. And so that's always the first thing I say, that I don't have the magic wand. Because if I did, to be totally honest with you, I would charge so much more. For my speaker's fee, all of it, you guys, so much more I would charge. But I will say that I think the very first thing is to acknowledge how frustrated they are and to try to dig into what is that frustration about. Usually it's about, I don't like how you're making me feel. I don't like how you're making me see myself, right? If I'm grounded in my own okayness as a staff person, again, I'm not talking about behavioral limits. You're not allowed to punch me in the face, right? In fact, I used to teach my students the very first rule of social work: don't get punched in the face. And if that seems abstract, it's not, right?
I think we can all relate.
We can all relate to that. No face punching. But in terms of, you're allowed to be a jerk. You're allowed to be super difficult. Difficult kind of implies that there's easy. And that implies me, right? What is difficult or easy for me? But if I say you're really allowed to feel how you feel and act how you act, and you're not allowed to hurt yourself, you're not allowed to hurt other people, but everything else, like, okay, I know this is taking a long time, but one of my favorites is when staff would complain about, well, Amy's doing destruction of property. And I'm like, have you seen our property? What exactly are we worried about here? But anyway, that's another story. So I think that when people are frustrated, what I would want to learn more about is, okay, so Amy's doing this, this, this. Tell me, the frustration is about what? What is it that should be happening? And people usually want to make it about Amy, but it's always about themselves, right? Amy's making me feel scared. Well, that's valid. How can we help you feel safe? Do we need more staff? Do you need space? What is that? Amy's making me feel like I'm not doing a good job. Well, what is your job? Is it to make Amy follow the rules? Uh-oh. Right, exactly. Because they're like, but so I do think, and this is a lengthy process, right? But I think that those conversations, whether that's as a team or one-on-one, about what is our expectation of Amy and what is our expectation of ourselves. And again, I think that if we really dig down as staff people, as clinicians, whatever, we still think our job is to fix. We need Amy to behave differently. The truth is, Amy may behave exactly the way Amy behaves forever. And that's okay. You hear that? Right? I will write a note. You guys, you see where I'm going with this. I could go on and on, but I think that's maybe where I would start is like when we're frustrated, it's because something's not being met, some expectation's not being met. And usually if we can compassionately challenge that expectation, no one's expecting you to fix Amy. And if we're truly honoring and validating Amy's experience, Amy's not broken. That's again, easy to say, hard to internalize, because we do think that we and everybody else are broken. Amy's not broken. If I work with clients who've had intense trauma and the aftermath has messed up their lives in many, many ways, those are real things and real challenges and real obstacles. And Amy may do stuff that makes her and everybody else's life harder than it needs to be, for sure. But she's not broken. Right? You see where I'm going with that? So I think it starts with working with those expectations. I could talk on and on about that, but I think that's where I would start.
I think it's interesting though, because we have some people here and on Zoom that have attended this is our 4th session, and I think a question has been asked that has almost given us that answer every single time, right? That the answer is, it starts with ourselves. It's not necessarily with the person we're working with. We had Dr. Jason Buckles, and we talked about challenging behaviors and really taking a hard look at it. Last week we had, we talked about ACT and FAT, and how can we sort of apply that and really looking at ourselves. And then we talked with Karen Harvey and sort of so that's interesting. The takeaway really sort of starts with us and what we're willing to apply and how we sort of see certain situations.
100%. And I think that to sort of bring this full circle, why I was so excited when I was offered the opportunity to come here is that is hard work, right? Looking at ourselves, working on that groundedness. How do I find my own okayness? How do I practice that self-awareness and self-regulating? That's effort, right? I think it pays off wonderfully, but it's effort. And now we've all just been hit with this hurricane. So I really was so grateful for the opportunity to say, we are all in the water right now. We are all feeling very broken. And I think pausing and acknowledging that and allowing some compassion for ourselves and for our experiences over the past 2 years, really, I think the longer I do this job, I tend to come back to the same answer, which is moving forward requires gentleness. So not only do we start with ourselves in terms of we are what needs to be worked with, but we have to start with gentleness with ourselves. And so we could say that for the whole topic today, it's about acknowledging where we've been and what's been going on for us and bringing that gentleness. And then we can work with what are my expectations and what's my self-arousal level and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, but I think it always starts with gentleness.
Yeah, that's interesting. In so many of my comments, like I think we're about out of time, but talk about that one of your last comments was about, balance in those days that sort of knock me off my rocker, right? But those days are so loud that it's hard to forget the days that I was successful or that I did make a difference. And so, I think, thank you so much for being a part of our conference. You know, we've been doing this for 10 years. We value your partnership and relationship, and I think we'll definitely have to continue this conversation and have you back to talk more about this. I think it's important as we are, you know, still feeling the effects of COVID is very loud and very real in what we do, and will continue to, you know, play a huge part in what this population, right? Like in the sheltering in place and the quarantining and the masks and returning to day program and not returning, and it's been a challenge, and I think it's far from over. So thank you so much, and thank you to everybody for being a part of ICPN for the past 10 years. We've been doing this for about 10 years now, and so thank you very much.
Just to wrap things up a little bit with some housekeeping items, sessions 1 and 2, so that would be Jason Buckles and Karen Harvey, continuing education has been sent out for those, so if you haven't received them yet, go ahead and reach out to me. Session 3, which was last week with Tyler and Matt, we are just about done with those. You should have them this week. If you don't receive them, let me know again. And then give us at least a week. We asked for 14 days to get the continuing education out for today's session. If you did miss session 1, 2, or 3, they are posted on our website for you guys to go back and view anytime you would like, or share your Zoom meetings, or just pull it up whenever. ICPN.org, and you can go to professional development and past workshops, and all of them are listed on there. And then we also have some for the summer posted on there as well, so if you want to come to our regular community trainings, we have at least 2 a month there, so we'd love to see you there as well. And just thank you guys all. Thank you all in Zoom land, taking time out of your day to attend, you know, either 1, 2, 3, or 4 sessions. We've enjoyed having you. And thanks to Amy and Laura. We appreciate everything.
Thanks, you guys. Thanks.